Let's turn now to that weather threat from coast to coast. Two powerful new storms moving into the west as millions try to recover from heavy rain, mudslides and snow trapping drivers and knocking out power. Our chief national correspondent Matt Gutman is there in Seattle with all the latest on this. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning, Cecilia. And that wind, it was powerful enough to uproot even enormous Douglas firs. This one got sent slamming into that house, and there was so much damage to power lines from trees that there are still thousands without electricity this morning.
Those ferocious West Coast winds Sunday knocking down trees and limbs, which ripped into power lines.
There went the power.
Transformers blown and power lines incinerated in a cascade of sparks and blue light. More than 250,000 people left without power on Sunday. Across Washington state, 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts plucking trees from the ground, slamming them into homes. That storm also bringing snow and whiteout conditions, backing up traffic on I-80 for miles. Snow pummeling the Sierra Nevada, cars slipping on icy roads. Farther south, strong winds up to 70 miles per hour, sending large waves and high tides into the San Francisco Bay Area. Funnel clouds seen spinning from Santa Cruz to the coast of Long Beach. Torrential rains swamping roads, triggering mudslides on the Pacific Coast Highway near the Woolsey Fire burn zones. That flow, the size of 2 football fields, trapping vehicles in up to 4 feet of mud and debris. Crews bulldozing them out of the muck.
Now, Cecilia, that weather has mostly cleared, but there are millions along the West Coast bracing for another 2 additional storms. The first of those is set to hit tomorrow. I'm told the power crews will be out in force even before that storm hits. Cecilia.
All right, Matt, it's going to be a long day over there. Thank you. Let's get over to Ginger now with the latest on those 2 storms closing in on the west. Good morning, Ginger.
Good morning, Cecilia. The last thing people want to hear after their car is smashed or they wake up like my cousin did in Sacramento with water, rainwater, into her drawer because there's a tree through her bathroom. Yeah, the last thing you want to hear is that there's more storms to come. And look, we're on alert all the way from Washington and Oregon and California over to parts of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maine. Check out the line of storms. There's actually 3 lined up with the one that's already on shore. Tuesday is going to be the big day for the next one to come through, especially Northern California. We're talking about heavy rains again, inches of rain that happen very quickly. And by the time this is all said and done, the rounds of it, up to 4 feet of snow in the Sierra.
They say there's no shortage of petrol, but that's little comfort to motorists caught in the growing lines across central Mexico. The state oil firm Pemex is changing distribution methods to beat criminal gangs. They've been tapping into pipelines, stealing thousands of barrels of petrol at a time. That inflicts steep losses for the company and the country. The changes mean some places are struggling to keep their tanks full. One of the worst affected, Mexico's second city, Guadalajara.
It's really bad because we already went to several stations, but we didn't find any gasoline. It's been 3 days already.
It's a disaster. Everywhere it's a disaster. I've been to 2 gas stations and they don't have anything. Look at this. Where else do we have to go? If there isn't anything here, where else do you go?
Mexico's new president says he's no idea how long people will face shortages.
The truth is that we're already seeing positive results. We have a reduction in theft that has never been achieved before, so we're going to keep moving forward.
Pemex says about $7 billion in fuel has been siphoned off since 2016 alone. The president has ordered the military to start securing key installations while the company is changing distribution to use more tankers and fewer pipelines that are easily targeted. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera.
On Monday, the Huffington Post reported that 2 gay men have launched separate legal bids to overturn Hong Kong's ban on same-sex marriage, the first time the law has been challenged in court. The 2 men, an activist and a student, argue that the ban on same-sex marriage violates their right to equality under the Basic Law, the city's mini-constitution. They're asking the government to review and amend the law on marriage, currently defined as between a man and a woman, to the union of 2 persons.
China accuses the U.S. of violating international law after an American Navy destroyer sailed near islands claimed by Beijing in the South China Sea.
Such actions by the U.S. vessel violate the Chinese laws and international laws, infringe China's sovereignty, and undermine peace, stability, and good order in relevant waters. We firmly oppose relevant moves and urge the U.S. to immediately stop such provocations. We will continue to take necessary measures to safeguard national sovereignty and security.
China's reaction follows a naval operation described by the U.S. as an attempt to counter Beijing's excessive maritime claims in the sea. A spokeswoman for the U.S. Navy said the USS McCampbell sailed within 12 nautical miles of the Paracel Islands to carry out a freedom of navigation operation. Beijing has in the past condemned Washington and its allies for similar operations. Author and columnist Einar Tangen believes the deployment of the U.S. naval forces in the South China Sea is aimed at building up pressure on Beijing.
Well, as usual, they're reacting to classic Donald Trump, who is making trade and security issues an attempt to gain leverage. This is not a way of starting serious trade negotiations, but it appears to be the way that Donald Trump likes to. As bad as it could get would be a miscalculation, especially on the part of Washington, that they can interfere perhaps in Taiwan, or that they come in the territorial zones claimed by China, in which case there could be a military altercation which could rapidly escalate into some sort of large-scale military operation. This is exactly what the world does not need, especially as it's already been roiled by these tariffs being taken out by the U.S. against the U.S. And the rest of the world.
According to a report by Reuters on Tuesday, the Afghan Taliban called off peace talks with U.S. officials in Qatar this week, citing an agenda disagreement regarding the involvement of Afghan officials, as well as a possible ceasefire and prisoner exchange. On Wednesday, 2 days of peace talks were set to start. However, the militant group said they had refused to allow puppet Afghan officials to participate. America's war in Afghanistan is the nation's longest overseas military operation, costing nearly $1 trillion and claiming the lives of tens of thousands of people. A Taliban source told Reuters the U.S. officials insisted that the Taliban should meet the Afghan authorities in Qatar, and both sides were in disagreement over declaring a ceasefire in 2019.
As the U.S. and China kick off renewed trade talks, the U.S. sent one of its guided missile destroyers through Chinese-claimed waters. According to Business Insider, a Chinese official called the action a provocation. China has made sovereignty claims near the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea that are not internationally recognized. Vietnam, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines have all made competing claims. A spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that China had sent warships and aircraft in response to the presence of the guided missile destroyer USS McCampbell.
Reuters reports North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is visiting China at the invitation of Chinese President Xi Jinping. This comes only days after warning he may take an alternative path if the United States does not ease sanctions and pressure on his country. The visit, confirmed by North Korean and Chinese state media, will likely lead to Kim's fourth summit with Xi in the past year, and comes amid plans for a second summit with Trump aimed at denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. Kim held 3 summits last year with Xi, his most important ally.
Defense Chief Chung Kyung-do held a phone with his U.S. counterpart Patrick Shanahan, who is serving as acting defense secretary since the departure of James Mattis. According to Seoul's Ministry of National Defense, during the meeting held earlier in the day, the 2 military leaders reaffirmed maintaining a combined defense posture and close military consultations. In the face of upcoming security changes and challenges, they vowed to further the 2 countries' alliance, which they both agreed that it has been functioning a key role in maintaining peace and stability on the Korean peninsula during the past 7 decades. Chung and Shanahan also agreed on the importance of military cooperation and joint efforts in establishing perpetual peace on the peninsula, as well as for successfully achieving complete denuclearization. They vowed to continue close partnerships for continual development of the bilateral alliance.
We are going to go over to Ginger and now turning to fast-moving storm bringing snow, rain, and strong wind across the Midwest into the Northeast. Jen, you have it all. It seems like winter is coming. It's going to be cold.
Finally feeling like winter in a lot of the country. And you can see Manistee, Michigan, 6 to 13 inches of snow fell in northern Michigan on the lakes. And I'm telling you, I grew up on Lake Michigan. It can get riotous, and it was up to 20-foot waves. Look at what happened to this lighthouse beacon. It was there in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And just moments after the water and wind just kind of took it over, it's gone. So that thing that had been there for decades at least, taken out by those strong southeast winds. Now we see wind advisories all the way from Indianapolis back to North Dakota. Those wind gusts will top 30 to even 50 miles per hour. And tomorrow we get it here in the Northeast. So if you're in Boston or New York City, Washington, D.C., you'll see some of those gusts reach 24 or 25 miles per hour. Windy all the way through
The French Prime Minister has
Thursday.
announced plans to ban participation in unauthorized demonstrations. He said the government would introduce a new law punishing demonstrators by having to pay for the damage caused to businesses and property during protest. The decision follows new waves of protests that turned violent in Paris and in cities over the weekend. Statistics show the Yellow Vest movement will take a toll on the French economy, forecasting a slower growth of 1.5% for last year. That's down 2 percentage points from an earlier estimate.
Since the Trump-Kim Singapore summit in June, the Trump administration has regularly shifted its stance on denuclearization. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has repeatedly stressed on complete and verifiable denuclearization before economic sanctions can be eased. However, the U.S. president insists he's ready to give the DPRK more time.
I never said speed. Look, it's been this way for 80-plus years.
Over the past 2 months, 3 statements in particular highlight the changing narrative coming out of the White House. On November the 20th, Pompeo told South Korea that denuclearization should be prioritized over an expansion of bilateral relations on the peninsula. Then in December, it was announced the Trump administration is planning to review its ban on American citizens traveling to the DPRK to help facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. And finally, on Christmas Eve, the U.S. president tweeted that he's looking forward to a second meeting with Kim Jong-un. On 2nd January this year, Trump showed off a letter written by Kim Jong-un and hailed his relationship with the DPRK leader.
Just got a great letter from Kim Jong-un. We really established a very good relationship. A lot of good things are happening.
With Washington preparing for a second summit, the White House's prevarications seem to be evoking anger and frustration in Pyongyang. In November, the DPRK hit out at the U.S. for imposing fresh sanctions against 3 of its top officials. It warned the move could block the path to denuclearization on the Korean peninsula forever. 3 days later, the DPRK's official news agency published an article demanding that Washington revoke its nuclear threat to the DPRK before asking it to denuclearize. In a televised New Year's address, Kim Jong-un welcomed the planned meeting while warning the U.S. over continuing economic sanctions.
DPRK would have no option but to explore a new path in order to protect our sovereignty if Washington continues to break its promises and misjudges our patience.
The United States operate a network of nuclear-capable submarines and bombers off the coast of South Korea and Japan. And there are close to 30,000 American troops stationed in South Korea. The U.S. has not yet indicated if it's willing to consider DPRK's demand, although Trump says he wants Seoul to pay more towards the maintenance of the U.S. troops in the country. With Nayeon Seth, Ma Ke, CGTN.
68-year-old Cardinal Philippe Barbarin, one of the most prominent Catholic figures in France, arrived for the start of his court proceedings. The Archbishop of Lyon is accused of helping to cover up abuse in one of his parishes. 5 others from his diocese are also facing charges. The case is about Father Bernard Prénon, who has acknowledged abusing boys and is set to be tried later this year. More than 85 people say he abused them during the 1980s and 1990s. His alleged victims came to court hoping for answers.
The cardinal is responsible for the Diocese of Lyon, and in 2013 he promoted a priest as dean who some years before had admitted to having abused children. When you are responsible for a person who has admitted to having abused and raped children, to promote him as dean, thus putting him in contact with many more believers and children, is simply irresponsible.
I think that at last we will know the truth about the mechanism of silence, and I think that the 3 days are a way for us to have real answers and to know how it was possible for a sexual predator to remain in his position for 50 years, to have responsibilities without being asked a single question.
Cardinal Barbarin faces up to 3 years in prison and a fine of $54,000 if convicted of failing to report the abuse of minors. He denies the allegations. There have been numerous cases of sexual abuse of children within the Roman Catholic Church. And Pope Francis has reiterated the Church's commitment to preventing such crimes.
Here I can't refrain from speaking about one of the plagues of our time, which sadly has involved some members of the clergy. The abuse of minors is one of the vilest and most heinous crimes conceivable. Such abuse inexorably sweeps away the best of what human life holds out for innocent children and causes irreparable and lifelong damage. The Holy See and the Church as a whole are working to combat and prevent these crimes and their concealment.
This case will likely hinge on whether Cardinal Barbarin should have reported a priest under his responsibility to police once he learned about the allegations against him. For now, the Cardinal will have to answer some very hard questions in this courtroom in the days ahead. Dorsa Jabari, Al Jazeera.
From where Frank Lagunas stands, which for the past couple weeks has been at home, the forecast for workers employed by the U.S. government is gloomier than ever.
Some will be paying their mortgages, some will be paying their car payments, some will be paying their credit cards.
As a furloughed chemist for the Environmental Protection Agency, responsible for overseeing the cleanup of some of the most toxic waste sites in the country, he has been deemed a non-essential worker. Also non-essential, it seems, is the environment.
Well, there's nobody there to safeguard current regulations and oversee any potential environmental damage.
So there's a violation of EPA law?
There's no one there to, enforce current law.
Repeated shutdowns have led to a brain drain. Over the past 2 years, the Chicago region, covering several states, has seen 150 of the EPA's 950 employees leave.
It's almost lunchtime here at the Federal Building in downtown Chicago, and it's normally bustling, but today is unusually quiet. And on Friday, many workers will be missing their first paycheck of the year.
Across the U.S., about 800,000 federal workers who earn $43,000 a year on average are either working without pay or not working at all. From national parks to the Farm Service Agency to the Alcohol Tax and Trade Bureau, which has stopped approving labels for new beer and wines. Among those federal employees is Sam Kitchen, a correctional officer at Chicago's federal prison, home to some of the nation's most dangerous inmates.
Your drug runners, murderers, rapists.
But he's not staying home. He's considered an essential worker. He's just not getting paid.
Do we pay our mortgage? Do we pay our house payments? What's the judge going to say if I can't pay my child support? We do a necessary job, a thankless job, but a job that the public expects us to do. Now, we expect our elected officials to do what they are elected to do. Now, if they want to walk around and say, okay, we're not going to pay you, how about they cut their pay and donate it to some federal employees so they could get paid?
For now, he and thousands of other federal employees wait for the president, who donates his salary to charity, and members of Congress, who are getting their paychecks without pause, to break the impasse and fund the government. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Chicago.
When she was told to cover anti-government protests for her newspaper, Rabah knew it would not be an easy assignment. She'd heard of arrests in previous protests, but didn't expect it to be her turn and just for carrying out her work.
I went to cover the protests when a pickup truck came and fired tear gas at protesters. People fled in different directions. I ran into a hospital, but tear gas was fired into the building. Masked men came in and started threatening people, and when they found out I was a journalist, they arrested me along with the others. They were beating people they arrested with batons as they took us to the station.
Protests in Sudan started in December over bread price rises and high inflation. Within 2 days, they turned into anti-government demonstrations, with people demanding that President Omar al-Bashir step down after 29 years in power. The protests spread nationwide, and some social media platforms were blocked. Workers from various sectors went on strike. Many were arrested for saying they wanted a change in government.
We were holding our posters and had barely come out of the university compound when men in pickup trucks came and started beating us and told us to get in the pickup. They took us to the station and started humiliating us and calling us names.
The protests are now in their third week, with more to come in the days ahead. Sudan's government says 816 people have been arrested since the protests began, but opposition groups and activists say that number is well over 1,000. The opposition also says security forces are intimidating people and targeting journalists to stop the news of the demonstrations from spreading. The government says 19 people were killed in the protests, but Amnesty International says the number was nearly 40 in the first week alone. The head of the police says his forces did nothing wrong.
The incidents and violence are caused by those who want to destroy and loot and those who have alternative agendas. They used weapons and burnt institutions and instigated people to protest against the nation. The police have handled the protesters with the highest level of professionalism and self-restraint.
Demonstrators say they will continue to protest against President al-Bashir's rule. The government says it will remain in power. More lives are expected to be lost, and even more are expected to be arrested as the two sides remain defiant. Iba Morgan, Al Jazeera, Khartoum.
Actor William Shatner has ventured into the final frontier as Captain James T. Kirk in Star Trek, and now he says he'd take to the stars for real if he had the right traveling companion. On Twitter, a follower asked Shatner if he'd go to space should SpaceX founder Elon Musk offer him the chance. ComicBook.com reports Shatner upped the idea by saying, "Yes, with him in the seat next to me, I'll hold his hand during takeoff as an added bonus." Shatner also recently shared that he'll be exploring another frontier, the stage of the historic Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. He'll make his Grand Ole Opry debut February 15.